She was known as the Witch of Buchenwald. In the history of the Third Reich, a regime that produced some of the most depraved criminals the modern world has ever seen, Ilse Koch managed to stand apart. Not for the scale of her crimes, not for the number of orders she signed, but for the intimate, personal, almost gleeful cruelty she directed at the prisoners who fell within her reach. She was a woman who had grown powerful, not despite the brutality of the concentration camp system, but because of it. She inhabited it, thrived within it, and inflicted suffering on thousands of human beings with a malice that left witnesses and prosecutors struggling to find adequate words. Her name became synonymous with a specific kind of horror, one that lingered long after the war ended and the camps were liberated, and one that refused to fade even as decades passed and the world tried to move on. What did Ilse Koch actually do? How did a woman born into ordinary German life come to be regarded as one of the worst perpetrators of the Holocaust? And what became of her when justice finally arrived? In this video we will find out, so without further ado, let us begin. Ilse Koch was born Margarete Ilse Köhler on September 22, 1906 in Dresden, Germany. She was the daughter of a factory worker, and her early life gave no particular indication of the path she would eventually take. She attended school in Dresden, showed no exceptional academic gifts, and after leaving school she worked as a secretary and then as a bookkeeper. By the standards of Weimar Germany, she was an unremarkable young woman, navigating the difficult economic and social pressures of a country that was still trying to recover from the humiliation of defeat in the First World War and the catastrophic collapse of the German economy in the early 1930s. Like millions of her countrymen, she was swept up in the rising tide of National Socialism. She joined the Nazi Party in 1932, a year before Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, placing her among the ideological true believers who had embraced the movement before it had achieved total power. It was through the Nazi Party that she would meet the man who would transform her life and, in doing so, transform her into a figure of infamy. Karl Otto Koch was an SS officer whose career was on the rise during the years in which the concentration camp system was being built and expanded. He was not a man of particular distinction, but he was part of the machinery of terror that the SS had constructed across Germany, and later across occupied Europe. Ilse met Karl Koch, and the two were married in 1936. It was a marriage that would place Ilse at the very heart of the concentration camp world. Karl Koch's appointments would take them first to Sachsenhausen, then to the newly established camp at Buchenwald, near the city of Weimar in central Germany. Buchenwald was opened in 1937 on the slopes of the Ettersberg, a hill that in better days had been associated with the great German writer Goethe. The irony of this proximity to one of the greatest figures of German humanist thought was not lost on the prisoners who were marched through its gates. Karl Koch became the first commandant of Buchenwald, and Ilse Koch became its mistress. It was here, in the years between 1937 and 1941, that Ilse Koch would establish her reputation and commit the acts that would haunt her name forever. Buchenwald, in the years of its early operation, was a place of systematic brutality. The prisoners held there included political opponents of the Nazi regime, Jews, criminals, and various other categories of people deemed undesirable by the state. They were subjected to forced labor, inadequate food, savage punishment, and arbitrary violence. The SS guards operated in an atmosphere that encouraged cruelty and punished mercy. Karl Koch ran the camp with a combination of corruption and viciousness that would eventually draw the attention of even the SS's own internal investigators. But it was Ilse Koch who came to embody a particular face of the camp's terror. She was an SS Aufseherin, a female overseer, though her status as the commandant's wife gave her a power and a freedom to act that went well beyond any formal rank. Prisoners reported that she would ride through the camp on horseback, a figure of arrogance and menace, and that she would select prisoners for punishment seemingly at random, pointing them out as she passed and directing guards to beat or abuse them. Witnesses recalled that she appeared to take pleasure in this, that the suffering of prisoners was not a necessary evil to her, but something she actively sought out and enjoyed. Her physical appearance was frequently commented upon in testimony and reports. She was described as a tall, red-haired woman with a commanding presence, and she used that presence as a weapon. The accusations against Ilse Koch became increasingly specific and increasingly horrifying as the war went on. Among the most damning and most debated allegations was that she had items made from the tanned skin of murdered prisoners. This claim, which would come to define her public image perhaps more than any other, emerged from testimony by survivors and was investigated with extraordinary intensity during the post-war trials. The allegation was that certain prisoners with distinctive tattoos were selected for this purpose, that they were killed, and their skin was removed and processed, and that the resulting material was used to make lampshades, book covers, and other objects. The lampshade allegation in particular became one of the most notorious symbols of Nazi depravity in the popular imagination. Whether these specific objects were definitively proven to have been made from human skin became one of the most contested issues in both the legal proceedings and the historical investigations that followed. What was not in doubt was that the medical facilities at Buchenwald were conducting horrifying experiments on prisoners, that bodies were being misused after death, and that Ilse Koch occupied a central place in the atmosphere of terror and exploitation that made all of this possible. Beyond the specific allegations about human skin, Ilse Koch's cruelty took many other documented forms. She was known for demanding that prisoners be beaten, for ordering punishments for perceived infractions that were either trivial or entirely imaginary, and for using her position to terrorize women prisoners in particular. Survivor testimony described a woman who seemed to revel in her power, who derived genuine satisfaction from the sight of human suffering, and who understood perfectly well what she was doing. She was not a bystander. She was not a reluctant participant. She was an active agent of persecution who used the environment of the concentration camp as a personal arena for the exercise of sadism. The prisoners of Buchenwald feared Karl Koch, but many would later testify that they feared his wife even more. She was more visible, more present, more directly engaged with the daily texture of violence that defined life inside the camp. The Koch household at Buchenwald was itself a place of considerable corruption and excess, even by the standards of the SS. Karl Koch was using camp resources, including prisoner labour, to build himself a lavish personal residence, to furnish it with stolen goods, and to maintain a lifestyle far beyond anything his official salary could have supported. This corruption was not unique in the SS, but it was extensive enough that it eventually drew official attention. The SS's own court, das SS-Unpolizeigericht, began investigating Karl Koch for embezzlement and other offences. Ilse Koch was by this point deeply implicated in the household finances and lifestyle that were under scrutiny. In 1941, Karl Koch was transferred from Buchenwald to the camp at Majdanek in occupied Poland, and Ilse went with him. But the transfer did not end the investigation. The SS investigators continued their work, and the Kochs continued their corrupt and brutal practices at Majdanek. The investigation into Karl Koch's conduct eventually resulted in his arrest by the SS in 1943. He was accused of corruption, embezzlement, and murder, the latter charge relating to the killing of prisoners who might have given testimony against him. In an extraordinary development, the man responsible for investigating the Kochs was SS Judge Georg Konrad Morgan, who pursued the case with unusual tenacity. Ilse Koch was also arrested at this stage, and she was held briefly in custody. Karl Koch was eventually tried before an SS court, found guilty, and executed in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended. The fact that the SS itself had executed Karl Koch would become a significant element in the post-war legal proceedings involving Ilse. She would argue, with some effect on at least one occasion, that the SS had already dealt with the crimes of Buchenwald, and that she herself had been held and investigated and ultimately released without conviction by the SS court. This argument, as we will see, had serious consequences for the course of justice. In the meantime, Ilse Koch had been released from SS custody in 1943 following an investigation that cleared her of the specific charges being pursued at that time. She returned to ordinary civilian life in Germany, retreating to a house in Ludwigsburg where she had a son. She was pregnant when released, and the identity of the child's father was itself a matter of some controversy. She lived in Ludwigsburg through the final years of the war, seemingly removed from the world of the camps. But the American forces who liberated Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, found a place whose horrors had not diminished with the Koch's departure. The liberation of Buchenwald was one of the most significant moments in the entire history of the Allied campaign, not because of its strategic importance, but because of what it revealed. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself visited the camp and directed that American soldiers and German civilians be brought to witness what had been done there. He wanted the world to know, and he wanted no one to be able to claim ignorance. When the investigators and prosecutors began their work in the aftermath of liberation, the name of Ilse Koch featured prominently in survivor testimony from the very beginning. She was identified by former prisoners as one of the central figures of terror at Buchenwald. The search for her was not a prolonged one. She was found in Ludwigsburg, living as a civilian, and she was arrested by American forces in June 1945. She was 38 years old, and she was now facing the consequences of what she had done. The path to justice, however, would prove to be far more complicated, far more contentious, and far more troubling than many had expected. The legal proceedings that followed would span years, span multiple jurisdictions, and generate controversy that echoed through German politics for decades. The story of what happened to Ilse Koch after her arrest is in many ways as disturbing, in its own fashion, as the story of what she had done. The initial proceedings against Ilse Koch took place within the framework of the American military tribunal process at Dachau. The Dachau trials were a series of military courts established by the American forces to deal with crimes committed at specific camps. The Buchenwald trial began in April 1947, and Ilse Koch was among the 31 defendants. The trial proceeded on the basis of substantial survivor testimony, and the evidence presented was overwhelming in its documentation of the brutality of life and death at Buchenwald. The specific allegations against Ilse Koch included ordering beatings and whippings of prisoners, selecting prisoners for punishment, and the most notorious accusation of all, her alleged involvement in the use of human skin for the manufacture of objects. Witnesses testified to having seen lampshades and other items said to be made from tattooed human skin, and these testimonies gripped both the court and the world's attention. Ilse Koch, for her part, denied the most serious specific allegations against her. She claimed that she had not given orders for beatings, that she had not selected prisoners for punishment, and that the allegations about human skin items were fabrications born of hatred for her. She was, she said, simply the wife of the commandant, a private citizen in a military environment without real authority over the prisoners. The tribunal did not accept this defense. On August 14, 1947, Ilse Koch was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The verdict reflected the weight of survivor testimony and the prosecutor's presentation of the evidence. It seemed in the immediate aftermath that justice had been served. But within months, a development occurred that would cause outrage around the world and ignite a political firestorm that reached the highest levels of American government. In September 1948, the American military governor of Germany, General Lucius D. Clay, reviewed the sentences in the Buchenwald case as part of his general responsibility for overseeing the military tribunals. Clay's review led him to reduce a number of the sentences, and in the case of Ilse Koch, his decision was extraordinary. He commuted her sentence to 4 years of imprisonment, a reduction that effectively meant she would shortly be released, given time already served. Clay's reasoning, as he explained it, was that the specific charges relating to lampshades and human skin had not been sufficiently proven to the standard required for a life sentence, and that the evidence of her direct personal involvement in specific beatings and killings was not as strong as the original conviction had required. The reaction was immediate and explosive. American newspapers, politicians, and the public erupted in anger. Senator Homer Ferguson of Michigan launched a Senate investigation. Clay was called to testify and explain his decision. Across Germany, the reaction among survivors and their supporters was one of shock and grief. The woman who had been convicted of crimes at Buchenwald was to be released after a fraction of her sentence. The controversy forced a re-examination of the entire process, and it highlighted the deep tensions within the American approach to denazification and justice, tensions between the desire for rigorous accountability and the political pressures of the emerging Cold War, which were already pushing American policy toward rebuilding West Germany as an ally rather than punishing it as a defeated enemy. Ilse Koch was released from American custody in 1949 after serving her reduced sentence. But the story did not end there. The newly established West German government was not prepared to allow Ilse Koch to simply return to ordinary life. In 1949, German authorities arrested her again, this time under West German law, for crimes committed against German nationals. This was a significant legal distinction. The American military tribunals had prosecuted crimes against foreign nationals and Allied standards of justice. The West German prosecution was proceeding under German law, pursuing crimes against German citizens who had also been imprisoned at Buchenwald. The trial that followed was conducted in the Bavarian city of Augsburg, and it was, by any measure, one of the most significant proceedings in the early history of West German justice. Ilse Koch stood before a German court and faced German judges. The proceedings were extensive, the evidence was substantial, and the testimony was harrowing. The West German trial at Augsburg focused on a broad range of crimes. Prosecutors presented evidence of beatings ordered by Ilse Koch, of prisoners selected for punishment or death, of the systematic terror she had maintained at Buchenwald. Survivor after survivor came forward to testify. Former prisoners who had spent years trying to rebuild their lives, who had emigrated to America or Israel or other countries, returned to give testimony. They described specific incidents, specific acts of cruelty, specific moments when Ilse Koch had intervened in the lives of prisoners with devastating consequences. The testimony was consistent in its broad outlines even when individual details varied, and it painted a portrait of a woman who had used the power of her position with relentless, purposeful malice. The defense again attempted to present Ilse Koch as a woman of limited authority, a wife rather than a perpetrator, someone swept along by events she could not control. The court heard this argument and rejected it. On January 15, 1951, the Augsburg court convicted Ilse Koch and sentenced her to life imprisonment. This was now the second life sentence she had received, and this time there would be no General Clay to commute it. She was transferred to Aichach Women's Prison in Bavaria, where she would spend the rest of her life. The question of how she spent those years and what became of her inner life is one that historians and psychologists have returned to repeatedly, seeking to understand what, if anything, she felt about what she had done. The answer, based on the available evidence, is deeply troubling. Ilse Koch did not express genuine remorse. She made various statements over the years about her innocence, about the injustice of her treatment, and about the suffering she herself had endured through the long years of imprisonment. She applied for clemency multiple times. She maintained that she had been victimized by the process, that survivor testimony had been exaggerated or fabricated, and that her convictions reflected political considerations rather than genuine justice. In this, she demonstrated a refusal to acknowledge the reality of what she had done that many survivors found deeply wounding. What was the nature of Ilse Koch's crimes when examined in the cold light of historical analysis? The allegations about human skin lampshades have been contested and complicated by historical investigation in ways that require some careful examination. The American investigator who most thoroughly probed this specific claim was Benjamin Ferencz, who later became one of the prosecutors at the Nuremberg Einsatzgruppen trial and went on to a long career in international law. The human skin evidence at Buchenwald included specimens that were brought before the Nuremberg tribunal and examined by pathologists. The question of whether these specific items were definitively of human origin and whether they could be directly attributed to the orders or tastes of Ilse Koch specifically became subject to significant forensic and historical dispute. Some historians have argued that while horrific experiments and misuse of human remains certainly took place at Buchenwald, the specific lampshade narrative as it attached to Ilse Koch may have been somewhat embellished in the telling, gathering additional lurid detail with each repetition until it achieved a symbolic weight that went beyond the documented facts. Other historians and legal scholars have maintained that the evidence was sufficient and that the controversy was manufactured in part by those who wished to rehabilitate Koch or minimize her crimes. What is not in any meaningful dispute is the substance of what Ilse Koch did and the environment she helped to create and maintain. The beatings she ordered were real. The terror she exercised was real. The selections she made, pointing at prisoners from horseback with what survivors described as casual, almost bored cruelty, led to real suffering and real deaths. The atmosphere of fear and arbitrary violence that she embodied at Buchenwald was a daily reality for the tens of thousands of prisoners who passed through the camp's gates. Whether or not the lampshade evidence met every evidentiary standard, the human cost of Ilse Koch's behaviour was documented in the testimony of hundreds of witnesses and in the records of the camp itself. She was not a passive bystander who happened to be married to a criminal. She was an active participant who made choices, exercised power, and caused harm on a scale that defies ordinary imagination. The story of Buchenwald itself, independent of Ilse Koch, was one of the most important chapters in the documentation of Nazi crimes. When American soldiers of the 4th Armored Division and the 89th Infantry Division arrived at the camp on April 11, 1945, they found more than 21,000 prisoners still alive, many in conditions of near complete physical collapse. The surviving prisoners included people from across Europe, political prisoners, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, criminals, and others caught in the vast net of Nazi persecution. They had survived the camp's brutal regime, the forced labor, the inadequate food, the medical experiments conducted by SS doctors, including the notorious Dr. Waldemar Hoven, and the systematic killings that had taken the lives of more than 56,000 people during the camp's existence. The liberation of Buchenwald was a moment of joy and grief in equal measure. Joy for the survivors and those who freed them, grief for the magnitude of what had taken place there. Ilse Koch had been part of that history during the camp's founding years, from 1937 to 1941, the period in which many of its most fundamental patterns of brutality were established. The medical experiments at Buchenwald were a dimension of the camp's crimes that went beyond even the daily brutality of concentration camp life. SS doctors used prisoners as subjects for experiments involving typhus, spotted fever, and other diseases, infecting healthy prisoners and studying the progress of the illness and the effect of various treatments. Phosphorus incendiary bomb experiments were conducted on living prisoners. Prisoners were subjected to high-pressure experiments. The scale and systematic nature of this medical murder was documented at the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, where 23 defendants, mostly SS physicians and scientists, faced charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. 7 were sentenced to death and executed. Ilse Koch was not a doctor and was not directly charged with these experiments, but she had inhabited the same world, had shared social and professional life with the perpetrators, and had contributed to the culture of absolute contempt for prisoners that made such experiments possible. The broader context of Ilse Koch's crimes also requires an understanding of the role of women in the Nazi concentration camp system. The conventional image of the Holocaust and its perpetrators is one dominated by male figures, by SS officers, generals, and administrators. The reality was considerably more complex. Women served throughout the concentration camp system, primarily as Aufseherinnen, female guards who oversaw female prisoners and, in some camps, had broader interactions with the prisoner population as a whole. The training and deployment of female SS guards became increasingly important as the camp system expanded and as more women prisoners were incorporated into the labor force. Ilse Koch was in some respects unusual among these women because her power derived not from her rank as an overseer, but from her relationship with the commandant. She had access to the full machinery of terror in a way that most female guards did not. She could and did act on her impulses without the kind of institutional check that might theoretically have constrained a lower-ranking guard. This combination of position, personality, and opportunity made her particularly dangerous. Other women who served in the concentration camp system faced prosecution after the war, though many did not. Some of the most notorious female guards, women like Hermine Braunsteiner-Ryan and Maria Mandl, had careers that in some ways paralleled Ilse Koch's in their scope of cruelty. Braunsteiner-Ryan, known as the Stomping Mare for her practice of kicking prisoners to death, served at Ravensbrück and Majdanek. She was initially convicted by an Austrian court after the war, but served only 3 years before being released. She later emigrated to the United States and became an American citizen, living in a Queens neighborhood in New York under her married name, until she was identified by Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal in 1964. The subsequent legal proceedings that resulted in her extradition to West Germany took more than a decade and ultimately led to a life sentence in 1981. Maria Mandl, who served as head female overseer at Auschwitz-Birkenau and was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 500,000 people, was captured, tried by a Polish court, and executed by hanging in January 1948. These cases illustrate both the range of women who participated in the Holocaust as active perpetrators and the widely varying fates they faced in the post-war reckoning. Ilse Koch's case stood out from others not only because of the specific nature of the allegations against her, but because of the extraordinary public attention it received. The Buchenwald trial and its aftermath were covered extensively by the international press. The name Ilse Koch became familiar to millions of people who might not have known the names of more senior Nazi officials. There were several reasons for this. One was the particular nature of the human skin allegations, which combined horror with a kind of symbolic weight that made them extremely powerful as representations of Nazi atrocity. Another was the gender dimension of her case. A woman who participated actively and enthusiastically in the persecution and murder of prisoners disrupted conventional assumptions about the relationship between femininity and violence, assumptions that were particularly powerful in the immediate post-war period. Journalists and commentators returned repeatedly to the question of how a woman could have done these things, a question that Ilse Koch herself seemed designed by history to force people to confront. The question of how Ilse Koch came to be who she was is one that has occupied historians of Nazi Germany for decades. Hannah Arendt's famous concept of the banality of evil, developed in her account of the Eichmann trial, pointed toward the way in which ordinary people could be incorporated into systems of mass murder through the routinization of violence and the suppression of moral judgment. But Ilse Koch, while she did not occupy the senior bureaucratic position of someone like Adolf Eichmann, does not map neatly onto the model of the banal perpetrator. The evidence of her behavior at Buchenwald suggests not the absence of moral feeling, but the presence of positive enjoyment in cruelty. A willingness and perhaps an eagerness to harm others that went beyond the mere following of orders or the detached execution of administrative functions. This is what made her so disturbing, then and now. She was not simply a cog in a machine, she was a person who appeared to want to inflict suffering, and who had been given an environment in which that desire could be expressed with impunity. Psychologists and historians have proposed various explanations for this behavior, ranging from deeply ingrained anti-Semitism and ideological fanaticism to narcissism and sociopathy to the particular dynamics of her marriage with Karl Koch and her position in the camp hierarchy. None of these explanations is fully satisfying, and perhaps none can be. The attempt to understand how someone arrives at the capacity for the kind of cruelty Ilse Koch demonstrated is in some ways a necessary exercise because understanding is a precondition for prevention. But it is also an exercise with limits because there is a point at which explanation begins to shade into something that feels uncomfortably like excuse. What can be said with confidence is that Ilse Koch was not a product of some unique psychological aberration that set her entirely apart from ordinary humanity. She was a product of a specific historical and ideological environment, of a regime that systematically dehumanized its victims and rewarded its perpetrators, of a marriage that placed her at the center of one of the most brutal institutions that regime had created. She made choices within that environment, and those choices were evil. The world into which Ilse Koch was born in 1906 was one that was already carrying within it the seeds of the catastrophe to come. The German Empire had achieved its unification in 1871, and in the 4 decades that followed it had grown into one of the most powerful industrial and military states in the world. But that power rested on foundations that were more fragile than they appeared. The social pressures of rapid industrialization, the political tensions of an imperial system that was only partially democratic, and the aggressive nationalism that competed with internationalist and socialist movements for the loyalty of the German working class and middle class, all combined to create a society on the edge of crisis. When the First World War came in 1914 and then ended in defeat and humiliation in 1918, those pressures found expression in the political chaos of the Weimar Republic, in hyperinflation, in street violence between political factions, in the desperate search for someone or something to blame for Germany's suffering. The Nazi movement offered answers to this search, answers that were false and murderous, but that were presented with enough rhetorical power and organizational skill to attract millions of followers. Ilse Koch was one of them. She joined the movement before it had achieved power, which means she was attracted not by the rewards of being on the winning side, but by the ideology itself, by the vision of a purified German nation cleansed of its enemies. This ideological commitment would shape everything that followed. The city of Weimar, near which Buchenwald was built, carries a particular irony in this story that is worth dwelling on. Weimar was the city of Goethe and Schiller, of the great flowering of German classical culture in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It was the city that gave the doomed Republic of 1919 to 1933 its name, because the Constitutional Assembly that created the Republic met there. And it was the city at the foot of whose surrounding hills the SS built one of the most brutal concentration camps in the German interior. The contrast between the Weimar of Goethe and the Weimar of Buchenwald was not lost on thoughtful observers then or since. It was a contrast that spoke to something profound about the nature of the Nazi catastrophe, about the way in which a culture capable of producing some of the highest achievements in human civilization was simultaneously capable of producing some of its worst atrocities. The proximity of Buchenwald to Weimar was not accidental. The SS chose the Ettersberg precisely because of its proximity to the city, and some have argued that there was an element of deliberate mockery in the choice, a statement about the irrelevance of culture and civilization to the new order the Nazis were building. Whether or not that was the intent, it was certainly the effect. The concentration camp system that Karl and Ilse Koch entered when he was appointed Commandant of Buchenwald in 1937 was already a well-developed institution with its own brutal logic and its own administrative apparatus. It had begun as a system of improvised detention facilities in 1933 when the Nazi government moved immediately after taking power to round up its political opponents, primarily communists and social democrats, and hold them in places that were outside the normal criminal justice system. These early camps were brutal and chaotic, run by SA stormtroopers and local authorities without central coordination or consistent rules. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, gradually took control of the camp system and transformed it into something more systematic and more permanent. The SS ran the camps through a specialized unit, the Totenkopfverbände, or Death's Head units, which were responsible for guarding and administering the camps. The organizational structure, the hierarchy of command, the regulations governing the treatment of prisoners, all of these were developed and refined through the 1930s into a comprehensive system of institutionalized terror. By the time Karl Koch arrived at Buchenwald, he was entering a world with established routines and established expectations, a world in which cruelty was not only permitted, but was implicitly or explicitly required of those who served in it. Buchenwald under Karl Koch's commandancy was in some respects typical of the broader camp system and in other respects unusually brutal even by those grim standards. The camp was built by prisoners themselves who were forced to clear the forest on the Ettersberg and construct the barracks, administration buildings and other structures. The work was brutal. The conditions were dangerous and prisoners died during the construction phase. Once operational, the camp held political prisoners, Jews who had been arrested particularly after the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938, Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to renounce their faith or serve in the German military, criminals and asocials as the Nazis categorized anyone who did not fit their model of a productive German citizen, and eventually, as the war began and the camp system expanded, prisoners from across occupied Europe. The prisoner population grew rapidly, from a few thousand in the early years to tens of thousands by the height of the war. The forced labour system at Buchenwald was extensive, with prisoners working in quarries, in armaments factories, and in a wide range of other enterprises that fed the German war economy. The daily life of a prisoner at Buchenwald during the Koch years was one of relentless physical and psychological hardship. The morning roll call, which could last for hours regardless of weather conditions, was a fundamental feature of camp discipline. Prisoners stood in rows in the main square while the SS counted them and recounted them, and any discrepancy in the numbers could mean hours of additional standing while guards searched for the missing prisoner. If a prisoner had died during the night, their body would be carried to the roll call and propped up because the count had to be correct. The food was grossly inadequate, a thin soup and small amounts of bread that left prisoners chronically malnourished. The work assignments could be lethal, with prisoners worked to exhaustion and death in the quarries particularly. Punishment was administered for the most minor real or imagined infractions, with prisoners beaten publicly, made to stand in stress positions for hours, or subjected to the whipping post. The guards had essentially unlimited license to abuse prisoners, and the culture of the camp encouraged them to exercise that license freely. Into this environment, Ilse Koch brought her own particular brand of cruelty. The specific quality of what she added to the already terrible reality of Buchenwald was the personal, targeted nature of her interventions. The institutional violence of the camp was impersonal in the sense that it was directed at prisoners as a category, as subhumans to be worked, punished, and if necessary killed as the regime required. Ilse Koch's violence was more intimate than this. She noticed individual prisoners. She selected them. She pointed them out. Survivors described the terror of catching her eye, the knowledge that being noticed by the commandant's wife could mean being selected for a beating, a special punishment, or worse. She brought to the camp a dimension of personal malevolence that went beyond the cold, bureaucratic cruelty of the system as a whole. The prisoners who came to fear her most were those whose appearance or behaviour attracted her attention, those whose tattoos she found interesting, those who had professions or backgrounds that intrigued her, or simply those who happened to be in the wrong place when she was in a certain mood. The tattoo issue is central to understanding the most notorious allegations against Ilse Koch and requires more detailed examination. Tattooing was relatively common among certain categories of prisoners at Buchenwald, particularly among those who had been imprisoned before the war for criminal offences and among some foreign nationals. The practice of identifying prisoners by their tattoos, which included in some cases elaborate artistic designs, created a macabre dimension within the camp's already horrifying reality. The allegation that Ilse Koch had selected prisoners with distinctive tattoos for killing, specifically so that their skin could be taken and used to manufacture personal items, was at the core of much of the most intense testimony against her during the American military tribunal proceedings. Witnesses stated that they had seen lampshades and other objects that were said to be made from tattooed human skin in the Koch household. Some witnesses said they had been told this by other prisoners or by guards. Others claimed direct observation. The forensic dimension of these allegations was explored in detail during the proceedings. American investigators brought physical specimens that were said to be samples of tanned human skin to the Nuremberg tribunal, where they were displayed as evidence of the crimes committed at Buchenwald. The pathologist who examined the materials testified to their nature. A lampshade that was said to have been made from human skin was among the items examined. However, the specific attribution of these items to Ilse Koch's personal direction or collection proved more difficult to establish definitively than the prosecution had initially hoped. General Clay's subsequent review of the case and his reduction of her sentence focused in part on this evidentiary difficulty. Later forensic investigation, including DNA testing conducted in the 2000s on a lampshade that had come to be associated with Buchenwald, found no evidence of human origin in that particular item. This finding, while it related to a specific object rather than to the entire evidentiary record, added complexity to an already complex historical picture. What remains clear from historical analysis is that the misuse of human remains was a real and documented feature of the Buchenwald camp's operation. The camp's medical facilities, under Dr. Waldemar Hoven and others, conducted experiments on prisoners that resulted in death, and the handling of prisoners' bodies was governed by a complete disregard for any human dignity. Pathological specimens were preserved. Tattooed skin was documented in connection with the camp's records. Whether the specific items in the Koch household were made from human skin, and whether Ilse Koch personally directed their creation, remain questions on which historians do not all agree. But the weight of survivor testimony and the broader documented reality of what Buchenwald was and what was done there ensures that the case against Ilse Koch rests on far more than the lampshade allegation alone. The role of survivor testimony in the prosecution of Nazi war crimes is itself a subject that deserves careful consideration when examining Ilse Koch's case. The legal proceedings after the war relied heavily on the accounts of people who had survived the camps, and those accounts were extraordinarily valuable and, in the vast majority of cases, historically reliable. At the same time, the specific circumstances of bearing witness to crimes of this magnitude, often years after the events themselves, and in the emotionally charged atmosphere of a courtroom where the perpetrator sat just meters away, created conditions in which individual details could be misremembered or conflated. This is not a criticism of survivors who had endured unimaginable experiences and who were doing their best to convey what they had witnessed. It is simply a recognition of the limitations of human memory under extreme stress and over extended time. In the case of Ilse Koch, The broad patterns in the testimony were remarkably consistent, but some specific details varied between witnesses in ways that defense attorneys could and did exploit. The challenge of prosecuting crimes committed in a system designed to obscure evidence, destroy records, and intimidate witnesses was one that prosecutors across all the post-war trials had to navigate. All the political context of the post-war trials also shaped the proceedings against Ilse Koch in ways that went beyond the purely legal. The early Cold War was already transforming the relationship between the Western Allied powers and Germany by 1948, when General Clay made his controversial decision to commute Koch's sentence. The American policy toward Germany was shifting from occupation and denazification toward reconstruction and alliance. West Germany was to become a bulwark against Soviet expansion in Europe, and this meant that the United States had powerful incentives to maintain good relations with the German public and the emerging West German political class. The aggressive prosecution of Nazi war criminals, while morally essential, was politically inconvenient in this context because it was deeply divisive within German society. Many Germans who had participated in the Nazi system to varying degrees, or who had simply looked away from what was happening around them, had powerful reasons to want the prosecutions to end. Clay's decision, whatever his personal reasoning, was read by many observers as reflecting this political pressure. The outcry that followed Clay's commutation of Ilse Koch's sentence was one of the most significant public controversies surrounding the post-war trials. Senator Ferguson's Senate investigation brought Clay to Washington to testify and defend his decision. The hearings revealed deep disagreements within the American government about how to balance the demands of justice against the imperatives of Cold War policy. Clay maintained that his decision had been based purely on legal grounds, that the evidence did not support the original sentence in the specific charges that had been brought. His critics argued that he had sent a devastating message to Nazi war criminals throughout Germany, that the reduction of a life sentence to 4 years for the crimes documented at Buchenwald demonstrated that the Allied commitment to accountability was shallow and contingent. The controversy contributed to a broader reassessment of American policy toward war crimes prosecution, but it could not undo the decision that had already been made. Ilse Koch walked out of American custody in 1949, and whatever justice was to be served on her would have to come from Germany itself. The West German legal proceedings against Ilse Koch that began in 1949 and culminated in her conviction and second life sentence in January 1951 were in some ways a more satisfying exercise of justice than the American military tribunal had been, precisely because they came from within the German legal system itself. The Federal Republic of Germany, established in May 1949 as a democratic state under a new basic law, was committed at least formally to confronting the crimes of the Nazi era and prosecuting those responsible. The Augsburg trial of Ilse Koch was one of the earlier examples of this commitment being tested in a high-profile case. The proceedings attracted significant attention both domestically and internationally. The testimony of survivors was again central to the prosecution's case, and the German court proved more willing than Clay had been to give that testimony the weight it deserved. The conviction and the life sentence that followed were welcomed by survivors and their advocates as a belated but real act of justice. Ilse Koch arrived at Aichach prison in Bavaria following her conviction, and she would remain there for the rest of her life. The years at Aichach were not silent years. She continued to deny her guilt, continued to apply for clemency, continued to maintain that she had been the victim of a miscarriage of justice fueled by hatred and political pressure. She wrote letters, gave interviews on rare occasions, and communicated with legal advocates who believed her case merited review. Her applications for clemency were reviewed and denied repeatedly. The West German government, under the chancellorship of Konrad Adenauer and his successors, was navigating an extraordinarily complex set of pressures regarding the prosecution of Nazi war criminals. There was pressure from abroad, particularly from Israel and from Jewish organizations, to pursue accountability aggressively. There was pressure from within Germany from those who had been part of the Nazi system or who had family members who had participated in it and who wanted the prosecutions to stop. The Ilse Koch case, given its public profile, its connection to the most notorious symbol of Nazi atrocity in the popular imagination, and the international attention it had received, was not easily resolved by administrative clemency. What was life like inside Aichach for Ilse Koch during the 1950s and 1960s? The historical record on the interior dimensions of her imprisonment is limited, but some details are known. She had given birth to a son, Uwe, before her arrest, and the child's upbringing during the years of her imprisonment was a matter of significant emotional weight for her. Ilse Koch was born in 1947, during the period between her release from SS custody and her rearrest by the Americans. His father's identity was never definitively established, and his mother was imprisoned for essentially the entirety of his childhood and youth. The relationship between mother and imprisoned son was one of the painful human dimensions of the case that observers commented on, though of course the human suffering involved in this story was overwhelmingly that of the prisoners at Buchenwald, rather than that of the woman who had helped to create it. There were periodic reports of Ilse Koch's mental and physical health deteriorating during the years at Eichach. She reportedly suffered from depression and from what some observers described as increasingly paranoid thinking about her situation. She made repeated statements about the injustice of her treatment that became increasingly detached from the documented reality of what she had done. The question of whether Ilse Koch was legally sane throughout her imprisonment and whether any genuine mental illness contributed to her criminal behavior was raised at various points in the legal proceedings. The relationship between the Nazi ideology she had embraced and any clinical psychological condition was something that investigators and legal experts grappled with. The defense during both her trials had not primarily argued mental incapacity, focusing instead on the factual disputes about what she had specifically done and what authority she had possessed. But the question of her mental state in the later years of her imprisonment became more pointed as reports of her deteriorating condition accumulated. Was the person imprisoned at Eichach the same person who had ridden through Buchenwald, pointing at prisoners for punishment? Or had the long years of imprisonment, the guilt she refused to consciously acknowledge, the isolation and the unresolved trauma of her own history created a psychological state that bore little relationship to the woman of 1938 or 1940? These questions would ultimately be rendered moot by the manner in which Ilse Koch's life ended. On September 1st, 1967, Ilse Koch was found dead in her cell at Eichach Women's Prison. She had hanged herself. She was 60 years old. She had spent the last 18 years of her life in prison. And before that, she had spent additional years in custody during the various proceedings against her. She had lived long enough to see the Federal Republic of Germany become a stable and increasingly prosperous democracy, long enough to see the first generation of survivors begin to receive some measure of public acknowledgement for what they had endured, long enough to see the first serious historiographical reckonings with the Nazi era begin to appear. Whether she had engaged with any of this, whether the world outside her cell had penetrated the walls of denial and self-justification she had built around herself, is not known with certainty. What is known is that she took her own life on the first day of September 1967 in a Bavarian prison 22 years after the liberation of Buchenwald. The reaction to her death was complex and in some ways revealing about the state of German and international reckoning with the Nazi past at that moment. There was no widespread grief, and even among those who had campaigned for her release or questioned aspects of her conviction, the manner of her death was treated with a certain uncomfortable silence. For survivors and their families, the response was in many cases one of grim satisfaction that she had not been released, combined with a recognition that death, even self-chosen death, was not the same as justice. Real justice, if such a thing is possible for crimes of the scale committed at Buchenwald, would have required Ilse Koch to truly confront what she had done, to acknowledge it, to feel its weight. The available evidence suggests she never did. She died as she had lived in her prison years, maintaining her own narrative of victimhood, refusing to see the prisoners she had tormented as the real victims that they were. The legacy of Ilse Koch in the history of the Holocaust and in the broader cultural memory of the Nazi era is multifaceted and continues to be debated. Her name became, in the post-war decades, one of the most recognizable symbols of Nazi female perpetration, partly because of the specific nature of the allegations against her and partly because of the extensive media coverage her trials received. The image of the red-haired woman on horseback pointing at prisoners, or the image of the lampshade made from human skin, became part of the iconography of Nazi horror in a way that few other individual cases did. This cultural prominence had both positive and negative consequences. On the positive side, it kept the reality of what happened at Buchenwald in public consciousness during the early decades of the Cold War, when there were powerful pressures toward forgetting and moving on. The controversies surrounding her trials, and particularly the outcry over General Clay's commutation of her sentence, forced public and political engagement with questions of accountability that might otherwise have been quietly shelved. On the negative side, the particular focus on Ilse Koch and the specific allegations about human skin items meant that much of the public understanding of her case was shaped by the most sensational elements rather than by the full picture of what she had done and what Buchenwald had been. The lampshade narrative, in particular, became so dominant in popular treatments of her case that it sometimes overshadowed the more prosaic but equally real crimes she had committed, the beatings she ordered, the prisoners she selected for punishment, the atmosphere of terror she had helped to create and maintain. It also created a somewhat distorted picture of the crimes of the camp as a whole, focusing attention on the personal cruelty of individuals rather than on the systematic, bureaucratically organized mass murder that was the defining feature of the Holocaust. The historiography of women perpetrators in the Holocaust has developed considerably since the immediate post-war period. Earlier scholarship, shaped in part by assumptions about gender that were prevalent in the 1940s and 1950s, tended to treat female perpetrators as exceptional, as aberrations from the normal pattern of female behavior, and often sought to explain their crimes through their relationships with men rather than through their own agency and ideology. More recent scholarship, exemplified by works like Wendy Lower's Hitler's Furies, published in 2013, has taken a different approach, examining the participation of women in the Holocaust not as exceptional or aberrant, but as a dimension of a broader phenomenon in which women across the Nazi system, as secretaries, nurses, teachers, wives, and guards, participated actively in the perpetration of genocide. Lower's research documented hundreds of cases of women who participated directly in killings on the Eastern Front, who facilitated persecution, and who created and maintained the social and domestic structures that allowed perpetrators to function. Ilse Koch's case, in this broader historiographical context, appears not as a freakish exception but as an extreme example of a more widespread pattern. The denazification process that was supposed to cleanse German society of the Nazi ideology and its adherents was, by most historical assessments, only partially successful. The most prominent perpetrators were tried and in many cases executed or imprisoned, but the vast majority of people who had participated in the Nazi system to some degree, from bureaucrats who had administered the persecution of Jews to businessmen who had profited from slave labor, from soldiers who had committed atrocities on the Eastern Front to neighbors who had reported Jews hiding in their apartments, were never brought to meaningful legal accountability. The denazification courts processed millions of cases and produced verdicts that ranged from major offender to fellow traveller, but the actual consequences for most people fell far short of what the gravity of their actions demanded. By the early 1950s, the process had effectively ended, and West Germany was moving rapidly toward reintegration into the Western Alliance. A process that required, or at least was enormously facilitated by, a degree of collective amnesia about the recent past. This amnesia had real consequences for the survivors of the camps. They returned to a world that was largely not prepared to hear what they had experienced. Psychological trauma was not well understood in the 1940s and 1950s, and the social pressure on survivors to move on, to rebuild their lives, to not dwell on what had happened, was enormous. Many survivors internalized this pressure and spent decades in silence about their experiences. The later flowering of Holocaust testimony and memoir, which accelerated particularly in the 1960s following the Eichmann trial and continued to grow through the following decades, represented a partial recovery of what had been suppressed. But the early post-war decades were ones of painful silence for many who had survived the camps, a silence broken only occasionally by the kind of high-profile trials that brought cases like Ilse Koch's into the public arena. The Eichmann trial, which took place in Jerusalem in 1961, was a pivotal moment in this history. Adolf Eichmann, who had been one of the chief administrators of the Holocaust, responsible for organizing the deportation of Jews to the death camps, had escaped to Argentina after the war and had been living under a false identity for years when Israeli intelligence agents captured him in May 1960. The trial that followed was televised in part and was followed around the world. Hannah Arendt's coverage of the trial for The New Yorker, later published as Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, introduced concepts about the nature of perpetration in totalitarian systems that have shaped historical and philosophical discussion ever since. The Eichmann trial also had the effect of breaking down some of the silence that had surrounded Holocaust testimony in the preceding years. Survivors who had never been publicly heard were called to testify, and their testimony reached an international audience through the media coverage of the trial. The trial's impact on Israeli society and on Jewish communities around the world was profound. It also had ripple effects on the German reckoning with the Nazi past, contributing to a generation of German students and citizens asking questions about what their parents and grandparents had done. In the context of this broader reckoning, the case of Ilse Koch occupies a specific and enduring place. She was not one of the top-level planners and administrators of the Holocaust. She was not a Himmler or an Eichmann or a Heydrich. She was a camp commandant's wife who used the power her position afforded her to exercise personal cruelty on a large scale. Her crimes were real, well documented in the weight of survivor testimony, and her convictions were in both cases appropriate to the gravity of what she had done. The controversies surrounding her first conviction and the commutation of her sentence by General Clay remain important cautionary tales about the way in which political pressure can compromise the process of accountability for mass atrocity. The second conviction and life sentence, which was not commuted, represents the better chapter of this story. A German legal system taking responsibility for crimes committed on German soil under German authority. Buchenwald itself, after liberation, went through a series of transformations that reflected the political history of Germany in the second half of the 20th century. After the initial period of American occupation, the camp fell within the Soviet occupation zone, which became the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The East German authorities used the camp as a memorial site, but they shaped the narrative of what had happened there in ways that served their political purposes. The communist victims of Nazi persecution were emphasized in the East German memorialization, while Jewish victims received less prominent acknowledgement. The camp was also used by Soviet occupation authorities as an internment camp in the late 1940s, holding Germans suspected of Nazi activity, a use that added a grim additional chapter to the site's history. After German reunification in 1990, the memorial at Buchenwald was reorganized and expanded to provide a more complete account of the camp's history, including the period of Soviet use, and to give appropriate prominence to all categories of victims. Today, the Buchenwald Memorial is one of the most visited Holocaust and Nazi-era memorial sites in Germany, receiving hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. The prisoners who survived Buchenwald went on to live as varied as the experiences that had brought them to the camp. Some became prominent public figures, bearing witness to what they had experienced. Elie Wiesel, who would later become one of the most important Holocaust memoirists and who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986, was among the survivors liberated from Buchenwald on April 11, 1945. He had been transferred to Buchenwald from Auschwitz in the final months of the war, during the death marches that moved prisoners from the eastern camps as the Soviet army advanced. His memoir, Night, first published in 1958, described his experiences in the camps and became one of the foundational texts of Holocaust literature. Wiesel was not at Buchenwald during the period of Ilse Koch's residence there, but his presence at the camp's liberation and his subsequent life's work of bearing witness to the Holocaust placed him in a symbolic relationship to the history of the place. Other survivors returned to their home countries, rebuilt their families, and carried the memories of what they had endured throughout their lives. The weight of those memories, and the question of how to live with them, was something each survivor had to navigate in their own way. The question of how perpetrators like Ilse Koch understood their own role in what had happened is one of the most haunting in the history of the Holocaust. The evidence from her trials and from her years in prison suggests that she never arrived at anything resembling genuine comprehension of what she had done. She remained to the end inside a narrative in which she was a victim of persecution and injustice, in which the survivors who had testified against her were motivated by hatred rather than truth, in which the courts that had convicted her had been manipulated by political forces beyond her control. This was not unique to Ilse Koch. Many perpetrators of the Nazi crimes, when they did not simply maintain silence, developed elaborate self-exculpatory narratives that allowed them to avoid confronting the reality of what they had done. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, wrote a memoir in Polish captivity before his execution in 1947 that combined remarkable candor about the operational details of the death camp with a striking incapacity to emotionally engage with what those details meant. Albert Speer maintained for decades that he had been unaware of the Holocaust while simultaneously managing the economic and industrial system that depended on slave labor and fed the machinery of mass murder. The perpetrators' relationship to their own guilt was one of the most morally complex dimensions of the entire post-war reckoning. The SS court investigation that had led to Karl Koch's execution in April 1945 is one of the strangest chapters in the entire story of the Nazi concentration camp system. The idea that the SS, the organization responsible for running the camps and for much of the systematic mass murder of the Holocaust, had its own internal court system that prosecuted corruption and certain kinds of unauthorized killing within the camps might seem paradoxical. The SS was, after all, one of the primary instruments of genocide. How could an organization responsible for the murder of millions concern itself with the corruption of individual commanders? The answer lies in the distinction the Nazi system drew between authorized and unauthorized killing, between the systematic murder of prisoners that was state policy and the private exploitation and freelance killing that individual camp commanders might engage in for personal gain. Georg Konrad Morgan, the SS judge who investigated the Kochs and a number of other camp commandants, was pursuing a version of institutional integrity within a criminal enterprise, trying to ensure that the SS's organizational discipline and financial probity were maintained even as the mass murder of prisoners continued at industrial scale. It was a distinction that the outside world found, understandably, morally incomprehensible, but it was a real feature of how the SS understood itself and its operations. Georg Konrad Morgan's investigations at Buchenwald and other camps are historically significant not only for what they revealed about individual perpetrators, but for what they revealed about the camp system more broadly. Morgan, an SS judge who approached his work with what appears to have been genuine professional conscientiousness, investigated not only the Kochs, but also crimes at Auschwitz, Majdanek, Lublin, and other camps. His investigations documented in detail the corruption, the unauthorized killings, and the exploitation of prisoners that went on within the camp system. He brought charges against several camp commandants, including Rudolf Höss at one point, though not for the mass murder Höss oversaw, but for specific unauthorized acts. The evidence accumulated by Morgan during his investigations constituted a remarkable internal record of the camp system's operations and crimes, and much of it was made available to the post-war prosecutors. Morgan himself testified at the Nuremberg trials, providing what was in some ways the most detailed insider account of the camp system that the prosecution had access to. The distinction that the SS drew between authorized and unauthorized killing played a role in the defense strategies adopted by many of those tried after the war. The argument that what had been done in the camps was state policy, that the individual defendants had simply been following orders from a legitimate authority, was one of the most frequently deployed defenses at the Nuremberg trials and in subsequent proceedings. The Allied prosecutors, and ultimately the tribunal itself, rejected this defense, establishing the principle that following an illegal order from a state authority does not relieve the individual of personal criminal responsibility. This was a foundational principle of what became international humanitarian law, and its establishment at Nuremberg remains one of the most significant legal legacies of the post-war trials. In the specific case of Ilse Koch, the defense argument was somewhat different because she did not hold a formal official position that would allow her to claim she had been carrying out state policy. Her position was informal, derived from her marriage and the social authority it conferred. This made the defense of following orders less available to her, but it also complicated the prosecution's task of establishing her personal authority and responsibility. The structure of the SS concentration camp administration is worth understanding in some detail to appreciate the full context of Ilse Koch's crimes. Each major camp was run by a commandant who reported through the SS command chain to the concentration camps inspectorate, which was itself part of the SS's vast bureaucratic apparatus. Below the commandant were various departments responsible for different aspects of the camp's operation, including the political department, which was essentially a Gestapo presence within the camp and was responsible for interrogations and executions, the camp administration, which handled economic matters and prisoner labor, and the protective custody camp, which was responsible for the day-to-day supervision of prisoners. The female guards, the Aufseherinnen, were a distinct category within the camp administration who were responsible for overseeing female prisoners and in some camps had broader duties. Within this structure, Ilse Koch's position was anomalous. She was not part of the formal command structure in the way that a guard or an administrator was. Her authority was exercised through her relationship with the commandant and through the deference that the camp staff showed to the commandant's wife. This informal authority could in some ways be more dangerous than a formal authority because it was less subject to any institutional check, however inadequate those checks might have been in practice. The fate of other Buchenwald-associated perpetrators provides useful context for understanding the broader arc of accountability for the camp's crimes. Dr. Waldemar Hoven, who had served as the camp's chief physician and had participated in the medical experiments, as well as in the direct killing of prisoners by lethal injection, was tried at the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg's proceedings. He was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and was executed by hanging on June 2, 1948. The execution of Hoven represented a measure of accountability for the specifically medical crimes committed at Buchenwald, crimes that had resulted in the deaths of countless prisoners through deliberate infection, inadequate treatment, and outright murder. The doctor's trial as a whole was one of the most important of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings because it confronted directly the participation of medical professionals in the crimes of the Nazi state and established principles about informed consent and the ethics of human experimentation that formed the basis of the Nuremberg Code, one of the founding documents of modern medical ethics. Hermann Pister, who succeeded Karl Koch as commandant of Buchenwald in January 1942, and who therefore presided over the camp during the years of its greatest prisoner mortality, was also brought to justice. Pister was tried at the Dachau trials in the Buchenwald case alongside Ilse Koch. He was convicted and sentenced to death. However, he died in prison before the sentence could be carried out in September 1948. The fate of commandants at other major camps varied considerably. Rudolf Höss of Auschwitz was tried by a Polish court, convicted and executed by hanging at Auschwitz itself in April 1947. His execution at the scene of his crimes carried a particular symbolic weight. Richard Baer, who was the last commandant of Auschwitz, died in custody in Frankfurt in 1963 while awaiting trial. Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka, escaped to South America but was eventually extradited from Brazil in 1967, tried in West Germany, convicted of the murder of around 900,000 people and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1971. The variations in these fates reflected both the complexity of the post-war legal process and the determined efforts of Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal, who devoted their lives to ensuring that perpetrators were not allowed to live out comfortable retirements while their victims' families mourned. The role of testimony by former prisoners in establishing the record of what had happened at Buchenwald and in the other camps was not only a legal matter but a profound moral and historical one. The act of bearing witness, of standing before a court or a camera or a microphone and saying what you had seen and experienced, was for many survivors one of the most difficult things they ever did. It required reliving experiences that the mind might have worked for years to suppress. It required the courage to stand in a courtroom and point at the person who had caused you harm, knowing that the defendant's lawyers would challenge your account, try to find inconsistencies in your testimony, and perhaps accuse you of lying. It required trust that the legal system would treat what you said with appropriate seriousness, a trust that in the case of the American tribunal's treatment of Ilse Koch had been badly shaken by General Clay's commutation decision. And yet survivors came forward in case after case and gave testimony that formed the documentary backbone of the post-war trials. The organization of survivor testimony and the preservation of witness accounts became an increasingly systematic enterprise as the decades passed. The Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, established at Yale University in 1981, collected more than 4,000 videotaped testimonies. The USC Shoah Foundation, established by Steven Spielberg following the making of Schindler's List in 1994, collected more than 53,000 testimonies in 56 languages from 35 countries. These archives represent an extraordinary resource for historians and educators, preserving in permanent form the experiences of people who lived through the Holocaust in all its dimensions, as victims, as witnesses, and in some cases as perpetrators, reflecting on their actions. The specific testimonies of Buchenwald survivors, including those that bore on the crimes of Ilse Koch, are preserved in these and other archives, ensuring that the historical record of what happened at that camp will be available to researchers and the public for as long as the institutions that hold it survive. The broader question of memory and accountability that Ilse Koch's case raises has become increasingly relevant in the 21st century as the generation of direct witnesses to the Holocaust has passed or is passing away. The last survivors of the camps, now in their late 80s and 90s at the very youngest, are fewer with each passing year. The question of how Holocaust memory will be maintained and transmitted when there are no more living witnesses is one that educators, historians, and memorial institutions are actively grappling with. The answer lies in the documentary record, in the archives of testimony, in the physical memorials and museum installations at sites like Buchenwald, and in the educational frameworks that have been developed in Germany and internationally to ensure that the history of the Holocaust remains a central part of how young people understand the 20th century and its lessons. The crimes of Ilse Koch, documented in court records, survivor testimonies, and historical scholarship, are part of this record, and they will continue to be part of it. The specific memory of Buchenwald has its own particular place in this broader history. The camp was in the interior of Germany rather than in occupied Poland, where most of the major death camps were located. This proximity to ordinary German life, to the city of Weimar with its Goethe associations, to the civilian population of Thuringia, raised in an acute form the question of how much ordinary Germans knew about what was happening in the camps. The citizens of Weimar were aware that there was a camp on the Ettersberg, even if they claimed not to know its specific nature. Prisoner work details from Buchenwald were visible throughout the surrounding area. The smoke from the camp's crematorium was visible from Weimar on clear days. The American forces, at Eisenhower's direction, brought Weimar's population to visit the liberated camp in April 1945, forcing them to confront what had been done in their vicinity. The reaction of the German civilians who were marched through the camp was documented in photographs and in the accounts of American soldiers. Many wept, some fainted, some looked away, a few were reportedly defiant. The photographs of this encounter became some of the most haunting documents of the immediate post-liberation period, images of people being forced to see what they had claimed not to know. The question of German civilian knowledge of the Holocaust remains one of the most debated in the historiography of the Nazi period. Robert Gellatley's research, published in Backing Hitler in 2001, argued that the Nazi regime was more transparent about its persecution of Jews and others than had previously been assumed, and that ordinary Germans had much greater awareness of what was happening than the post-war myth of ignorance suggested. Daniel Jonah Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners, published in 1996, made an even stronger argument about the broad participation of ordinary Germans in the genocide. Both works generated significant controversy and debate, but together they contributed to a shift in historical understanding away from the model of a small group of fanatics imposing genocide on an ignorant or passive population, toward a recognition of the broader social participation in and awareness of the Nazi crimes. Ilse Koch was not a mystery in this context. She was not someone acting in secret or in isolation. She was living openly as the commandant's wife, entertaining guests, riding through the camp in full view of the local population, and everyone who knew anything about Buchenwald knew who she was and what role she played. The post-war fate of some of the less prominent individuals associated with Buchenwald illustrates the uneven nature of accountability more broadly. Many of the ordinary guards who had served at the camp, who had administered beatings, who had shot prisoners attempting to escape, who had participated in the day-to-day violence of the place, never faced legal proceedings at all. The denazification process sorted them into categories and assigned them varying degrees of nominal consequence, but genuine prosecution of lower-ranking camp personnel was relatively rare. The focus of the trials, both the American military tribunals and the subsequent West German proceedings, was primarily on more senior figures, on those who could be shown to have given orders or to have had command responsibility. This focus, while understandable given the resources available for prosecution, meant that many individuals who had committed real crimes walked free and resumed ordinary lives in post-war Germany. Some changed their names, some moved to different parts of the country, some found employment in institutions that should have screened them more carefully. The extent to which former concentration camp personnel were reintegrated into West German society without consequences was one of the more troubling aspects of the post-war period that later historiography brought increasingly to light. The Zentrale Stelle der Landesjustizverwaltungen zur Aufklärung nationalsozialistischer Verbrechen, the Central Office of the State Justice Administrations for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, established at Ludwigsburg in 1958, represented a belated attempt to address this gap. The office, usually referred to simply as the Ludwigsburg Authority, was created in response to the recognition that too many perpetrators were escaping accountability and that a coordinated national approach to investigation and prosecution was needed. The office worked to identify former camp personnel, gather evidence, and build cases that could be referred to regional prosecutors for trial. It played a crucial role in cases including the Auschwitz trial of 1963 to 1965. One of the most significant domestic West German prosecutions of Holocaust perpetrators, which brought 22 former Auschwitz personnel before a Frankfurt court and resulted in convictions for a range of crimes. The Ludwigsburg office continued its work for decades and is still operational today, having investigated more than 7,000 cases over its history, though the number of individuals still living and capable of standing trial has dwindled to very few. The Auschwitz trial of 1963 to 1965 deserves mention in any account of the broader context of post-war accountability for Nazi crimes, because it represented the most extensive domestic German reckoning with the Holocaust during the 1960s. The prosecutor, Fritz Bauer, who was himself a Jewish survivor of Nazi persecution who had fled Germany and then returned to serve the new republic, drove the prosecution with extraordinary determination against significant political resistance. The trial lasted nearly 2 years and heard testimony from more than 300 witnesses. The defendants included former SS guards and administrators who had continued to live ordinary lives in West Germany for nearly 2 decades since the end of the war. The trial was covered intensively by the German and international press, and its impact on German public consciousness about the Holocaust was significant. For many younger Germans who had grown up hearing sanitized or simply absent accounts of what their parents' generation had done, the Auschwitz trial was a shattering confrontation with reality. The subsequent impact on German culture, on the student movements of the late 1960s, on the political and intellectual life of West Germany, was profound and lasting. The particular case of female perpetrators in the concentration camp system, beyond the specific instance of Ilse Koch, is one that scholars have examined increasingly carefully in recent decades. The category of Aufseherinnen, the female guards, numbered around 3,500 women who served in this capacity across the camp system between 1939 and 1945. They were recruited, trained and deployed as a distinct but integral part of the camp administration, responsible primarily for overseeing the female prisoner population that grew enormously as the war continued and as more women were incorporated into the forced labor system. The training of female guards was conducted at Ravensbrück, the main women's concentration camp in Germany, where new recruits spent several months learning the routines and expectations of camp service. Some came to their positions with enthusiasm for the ideology and the power it offered. Others were more reluctant participants who found themselves gradually drawn into the violence and dehumanization of the camp environment. The range of behavior among female guards was enormous. From those who sought every opportunity to inflict suffering to those who tried, within the constraints of the system, to treat prisoners with some degree of humanity. The post-war prosecution of female camp guards was extremely limited relative to their number and the extent of their participation in crimes. Of the roughly 3,500 women who served as Aufseherinnen, only a small fraction ever faced legal proceedings. The reasons for this were partly structural, partly cultural, and partly a reflection of the inadequacy of the denazification process more broadly. Structurally, the The female guards were not the subjects of focused investigation in the same way that senior male officials were. Culturally, the assumption that women were primarily victims rather than perpetrators of violence meant that former female guards were less likely to be identified and pursued by investigators. Many of them married, changed their names, and blended into ordinary civilian life without difficulty. Those who were tried typically received lighter sentences than male counterparts who had committed comparable crimes, reflecting assumptions about gender and culpability that were deeply embedded in the legal culture of the time. Irma Gresser was one of the few female camp guards who faced the full weight of post-war justice. She had served at Ravensbrück, then at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and finally at Bergen-Belsen, where she was present when the camp was liberated by British forces in April 1945. She was 21 years old at the time of liberation. She was tried at the first Belsen trial in September to November 1945, convicted of war crimes, and executed by hanging on December 13, 1945. She was 22 years old at the time of her execution. The Grease case, like the Koch case, attracted enormous public attention and generated extensive media coverage. Grease had been one of the most sadistic of the female guards, documented in extensive testimony as having beaten prisoners, shot them, trained her dogs to attack them, and selected them for the gas chambers. The fact of her youth, the fact that she had been only a teenager when she first entered the camp system, was cited both by those who saw her execution as justified and by those who questioned whether someone so young could bear the full weight of moral responsibility for what she had done. These questions, while genuinely complex, cannot obscure the reality of what she did and the suffering she caused. The comparison between Irma Gresser and Ilse Koch illuminates some important distinctions in how gender, age, and institutional position affected the careers and post-war fates of female perpetrators. Grease was executed at 22, while Koch lived until 60. Grease was a relatively low-ranking guard who had direct physical contact with prisoners in ways that made her crimes unambiguously attributable to her personal actions. Koch's position was more elevated and more ambiguous, her crimes exercised through the mechanism of command and selection rather than through direct physical violence in most documented cases, though she was accused of direct physical assaults as well. Grease was tried and executed with relative speed by British military authorities, who had substantial first-hand evidence from the liberated camp. Koch's legal journey was far more protracted, more politically complicated, and more controversial. The comparison also illustrates the way in which the most extreme and dramatic cases of female perpetration, those involving direct physical sadism on the part of young women, were in some ways easier for the courts and the public to process than cases that involved the exercise of authority and complicity through more diffuse mechanisms. The concentration camp at Ravensbrück, which was the primary women's camp in the Nazi system and which also served as the training ground for female guards, had its own extensive history of crimes and its own post-war legal reckoning. Ravensbrück held around 130,000 female prisoners during its operation between 1939 and 1945, including political prisoners, Jews, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, and prisoners of war from across occupied Europe. The camp's female commandant for much of its operation was Fritz Sören, who was male despite the camp's primarily female prisoner population. The camp conducted medical experiments on prisoners, including bone grafting and muscle transplant experiments on Polish women prisoners who were known as the rabbits because of the experimental wounds inflicted on them. Several of the rabbits survived and testified at post-war trials. The Ravensbrück trials, conducted by a British military tribunal in Hamburg between 1946 and 1948, resulted in numerous convictions and executions of camp personnel. Dorothea Binz, one of the most brutal of the Ravensbrück female guards, was convicted and executed in 1947. Carmen Mori, a Swiss-born prisoner functionary who had used her privileged position within the camp to terrorize and murder fellow prisoners, was convicted and sentenced to death, but killed herself in her cell before the sentence could be carried out. The phenomenon of prisoner functionaries, prisoners who were given positions of relative privilege within the camp hierarchy in exchange for maintaining order among other prisoners, was a deeply troubling dimension of the camp system that complicated simple narratives of victim and perpetrator. The kapos, as these prisoner functionaries were known, were often themselves subjected to serious violence and lived under the constant threat of losing their privileged status and being returned to the general prisoner population, or worse. Some used their position with as much restraint as they could manage, trying to protect the prisoners under their nominal supervision. Others used it as an opportunity to wield power and settle scores, sometimes with a brutality that rivaled that of the SS guards themselves. The post-war legal status of capos who had committed crimes against fellow prisoners was genuinely complex and was handled differently in different jurisdictions. Some were tried and convicted, others were treated primarily as victims of the system that had placed them in an impossible position. The physical layout and daily routines of Buchenwald during the years of Ilse Koch's residence there have been reconstructed in considerable detail through survivor testimony, SS records recovered after the war, and the physical remains of the camp. The main camp, or Hauptlager, was divided into blocks that housed the various prisoner populations. The main gate bore the inscription, "Jedem das Sein," to each what he deserves, a motto that was a deliberate mockery of the Enlightenment idea of natural justice. The gate itself faced inward, so that prisoners could read the inscription on their way out to work, not on their way in. The camp's centre was dominated by the roll call square, the Appellplatz, which was large enough to hold the entire prisoner population for the twice daily counts. Around it were arranged the prisoner barracks, the workshops, the stables, and other functional buildings. Separate from the main camp, across a road, and behind additional fencing, was the special camp, the Sonderblock, where political prisoners and others deemed especially dangerous were held in conditions of even greater isolation and deprivation. The SS compound, where the Koch family lived and where the camp's administrative buildings were located, was separated from the prisoner area by fences and walls, but was physically adjacent to it. The proximity of the Koch household to the prisoner barracks was such that the sounds of the camp, including the sounds of punishment, would have been audible in the domestic spaces where Ilse Koch lived her daily life. The zoo that the Kochs had constructed within the campgrounds has been noted by historians as one of the more surreally grotesque details of life at Buchenwald. Karl Koch had ordered the construction of an animal enclosure that contained deer, foxes, and other animals, ostensibly for the pleasure of the SS personnel and their families. The zoo was maintained using prisoner labour. The contrast between the relatively comfortable lives led by the zoo's animal occupants and the conditions endured by the prisoners who fed and cared for them was not lost on survivors who described it in testimony. This kind of grotesque juxtaposition in which the ordinary markers of civilized domestic life coexisted with systematic mass murder and brutality was a feature of the camp world that has haunted subsequent representations of the Holocaust. The ability of perpetrators to maintain a division in their consciousness between the comfortable domesticity of their private lives and the horror of their professional environment is one of the most disturbing psychological features of the entire history of the Nazi camp system. The personal library and the decorating choices that Ilse Koch reportedly maintained in the Koch household at Buchenwald have also been referenced in historical accounts and testimony. She was said to have had an appreciation for certain kinds of art and furnishings, and the household was described as being fitted out with items of considerable value, many of which were believed to have come from the systematic theft of prisoners, property that was one of the constant features of the camp economy. Prisoners arriving at Buchenwald were relieved of all their possessions, which were catalogued and sent into the SS's system of confiscation and redistribution. Personal jewellery, money, watches, and other valuables went into a central fund. Clothing was redistributed or destroyed. The accumulation of wealth derived from prisoner property was one of the specific elements in the SS court's investigation of Karl Koch, who had been diverting significant sums into his own household. How directly Ilse Koch benefited from and participated in this theft was one of the subsidiary questions of the legal proceedings, though it was never the central focus of the charges against her. The Koch's social life at Buchenwald, to the extent that it can be reconstructed, reflected the extraordinary inversion of normal moral values that characterized the camp world. SS officers and their wives socialized with each other, attended parties and dinners, celebrated holidays and birthdays, and maintained the routines of middle-class German domestic life, all while the machinery of murder and forced labor operated just beyond their dining room windows. The socialization between camp personnel and their families was in some ways a mechanism for normalizing the abnormal, for creating and maintaining a social world in which what was being done to the prisoners was not a constant source of moral crisis, but simply the background condition of their professional lives. The wives of SS officers who lived in proximity to the camps, as Ilse Koch did at Buchenwald, were in various degrees aware of what was happening. The question of how they processed that awareness, how they integrated it with the ordinary routines of motherhood, housekeeping and social interaction, is one that has occupied historians of gender and the Holocaust. The testimony of Ilse Koch's son Uwe, who was born in 1947 and who therefore had no direct memory of Buchenwald or of his parents' life there, has occasionally been sought by journalists and historians seeking to understand how the children of perpetrators processed their parents' crimes. Uwe Koch's situation was in some ways particularly difficult, because his mother's name was among the most notorious in the entire history of Nazi perpetration, and because he had been born while she was in custody and had grown up without her. His life was shaped by the shadow of her crimes in ways that required him to navigate questions about identity and responsibility that most people never face. The broader phenomenon of the children and grandchildren of perpetrators grappling with their family histories is one that has been documented in psychological studies and journalistic accounts, and it speaks to the way in which the crimes of the Nazi era continue to reverberate through generations. The representation of Ilse Koch in popular culture and in the media has been extensive and has shaped public understanding of her case in ways that have not always been historically accurate. She appeared in numerous newspaper and magazine articles during the 1940s and 1950s, typically in pieces that emphasized the most sensational aspects of the allegations against her and that used her as a symbol of Nazi female depravity more broadly. The lampshade allegation, in particular, was repeated so frequently and with such graphic elaboration in the popular press that it achieved a status independent of the specific evidentiary record of the trials. By the time most people encountered the name Ilse Koch in the decades after the war, they knew her primarily as the woman who had made lampshades from human skin, and the complexity of the actual legal proceedings and the historical debates about specific evidence were largely unknown to the general public. She was the subject of a German film, Die Hexe von Buchenwald, The Witch of Buchenwald, which was produced in the 1970s and which dramatized aspects of her life and crimes. This and other cultural representations contributed to the solidification of her image as one of history's archetypal female monsters, a figure whose crimes could be invoked as shorthand for the worst that human beings are capable of. This kind of symbolic function, while it served certain purposes of collective memory, also came at a cost. When a real historical figure becomes primarily a symbol, the specific details of their crimes and their context tend to get simplified or distorted, and the broader lessons that might be drawn from careful historical analysis become harder to access. The real Ilse Koch, the product of a specific historical moment and a specific set of choices, is in some ways obscured by the monster figure she became in popular representation. The academic treatment of Ilse Koch's case has evolved considerably since the immediate post-war period. Early historical treatments, produced largely in the 1950s and 1960s, tended to focus on the legal proceedings and their outcomes, and to treat the specific allegations about human skin as established fact. Later scholarship, informed by more rigorous archival research and by the development of Holocaust studies as a distinct academic field, took a more careful approach to the evidentiary basis of specific claims while reaffirming the broader reality of Koch's crimes. The question of the lampshades in particular received detailed treatment in historical monographs on Buchenwald and in broader studies of the Holocaust's perpetrators. The consensus that emerged from this scholarship was nuanced, acknowledging that the specific lampshade narrative may have been somewhat embellished while insisting on the documented reality of Koch's cruelty and its devastating impact on the prisoners of Buchenwald. The broader question of what Buchenwald represented in the overall structure of the Holocaust is important for situating Ilse Koch's crimes in their proper context. Buchenwald was not a death camp in the specific sense that Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno and Majdanek were death camps, facilities built specifically and primarily for the purpose of mass killing, where the vast majority of prisoners who arrived were murdered within hours or days of their arrival. Buchenwald was a concentration camp, a facility for forced labor, terror, and the systematic destruction of its inmates through a combination of overwork, starvation, punishment, and selected killing. The distinction matters in understanding the camp's place in the Holocaust, though it must not be allowed to minimize the deaths of more than 56,000 people that occurred at Buchenwald during its operation. The camp's prisoner population included a significant proportion of Jews, particularly after the mass arrests following Kristallnacht in November 1938, but it also included very large numbers of non-Jewish prisoners, political opponents, Soviet prisoners of war, criminals, and others. This relatively diverse prisoner population distinguished Buchenwald from the extermination camps, which were primarily focused on killing Jews. The specific period of Ilse Koch's residence at Buchenwald, from 1937 to 1941, encompassed several phases of the camp's development. The first year or two were dominated by political prisoners, primarily German opponents of the Nazi regime. The population grew dramatically after Kristallnacht, when approximately 10,000 Jews were brought to Buchenwald in the weeks following the pogrom, vastly increasing the prisoner population and straining the camp's facilities to the breaking point. Many of these prisoners were released after paying ransom in the form of agreeing to emigrate from Germany, and by early 1939 the Jewish prisoner population had decreased substantially. But the broader prisoner population continued to grow through the early war years as the camp system expanded to hold individuals from the occupied countries. By 1941, when Karl Koch was transferred to Majdanek and Ilse went with him, Buchenwald held prisoners from across Europe and was operating as a major component of the forced labour economy. The crimes that Ilse Koch had committed were thus concentrated in the camp's founding years, the period in which its brutal character was being established and institutionalized. The transfer of the Kochs to Majdanek in 1941 represented a new chapter in their criminal careers, though one that was also their downfall. Majdanek, located near the city of Lublin in occupied Poland, was a camp that had begun as a prisoner of war camp for Soviet soldiers captured during Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union that began in June 1941. It was developed into a full concentration camp and eventually into one of the camps where large-scale gassings of prisoners took place. Karl Koch's behaviour at Majdanek was, if anything, even more corrupt and brutal than it had been at Buchenwald, and it was here that the SS investigation that would ultimately lead to his execution began to crystallize. Ilse Koch's behaviour at Majdanek is less extensively documented in the historical record than her conduct at Buchenwald, partly because fewer Majdanek survivors came forward during the American military tribunal proceedings, and partly because the focus of the post-war prosecutions at Majdanek was primarily conducted through Polish judicial proceedings rather than through the American or British tribunal system. But there is no reason to believe that the Ilse Koch who had exercised cruelty with apparent relish at Buchenwald underwent a moral transformation during her time at Majdanek. The Soviet liberation of Majdanek in July 1944 was itself historically significant. Majdanek was the first major Nazi camp to be liberated by Allied forces, and the Soviet discovery of its gas chambers, crematoria, and the enormous warehouses full of prisoners' shoes and other possessions provided some of the earliest physical evidence of the Holocaust that was presented to the world. Soviet journalists, including Konstantin Simonov and Vasily Grossman, wrote accounts of what they found at Majdanek that reached a wide audience. The visual evidence, including photographs and film footage, was used by Soviet propagandists, but was also genuine documentation of the scale and nature of the camp's crimes. The liberation of Majdanek preceded the liberation of Auschwitz by more than 6 months and gave the world its first direct confrontation with the physical reality of Nazi mass murder on the largest scale. The specific question of what Ilse Koch knew about the extermination program, the systematic killing of Jews and others in the death camps of occupied Poland, is one that bears examination. By 1941 and 1942, when Koch was at Majdanek and when the extermination camps were beginning their operations, the mass murder was an open secret within the SS and among those closely connected to the camp system. The idea that Ilse Koch, as the wife of a senior concentration camp commandant, was unaware of the broad outlines of what was happening is extremely difficult to sustain. The specific operational details of the killing at Auschwitz or Treblinka may not have been known to her in detail, but the fact of the genocide, the deliberate killing of Jews and others on a massive scale, was simply not the kind of secret that could be kept from someone in her position. The question of knowledge is important not because it adds to her personal criminal liability, which was established on the basis of her own direct conduct at Buchenwald, but because it bears on the broader issue of how the camp system operated within a society where knowledge of its purposes was far more widespread than post-war convenient memory suggested. The concept of the Nazi bureaucracy as a machine that functioned through the division of labor and the distribution of responsibility is one that has been central to historical understanding of how the Holocaust was implemented. No single individual designed, organized, and carried out the genocide. It was accomplished through the coordinated effort of hundreds of thousands of people who each play their part in a system that, taken as a whole, produced mass murder on an industrial scale. The administrators who organized the deportations, the railroad workers who drove the trains, the guards who processed the arriving prisoners, the doctors who selected those fit for work and those to be killed immediately, the workers who operated the crematoria, all contributed to the overall outcome. Ilse Koch's place in this system was as a person who helped to establish and maintain the culture of terror and dehumanization in one camp during a particular period. Her individual crimes were real and were her own responsibility, but they occurred within and were enabled by a system that distributed moral responsibility across an enormous number of people, most of whom never faced any legal consequences at all. The question of whether justice was ever truly served in Ilse Koch's case is one that admits of no simple answer. She was convicted twice of serious crimes, given 2 life sentences, and died in prison after more than 18 years of imprisonment. In a narrow legal sense, the system eventually delivered an appropriate verdict. But the path to that verdict was littered with failures, with the commutation of her first life sentence by an American. General under political pressure, with the years she spent as a free woman in Ludwigsburg, while her victims were trying to rebuild shattered lives, with a protracted and emotionally exhausting process that survivors had to go through to see her finally and permanently imprisoned. And the manner of her death, a suicide in her cell in 1967, was not the conclusion that justice ideally required. Justice, in the deepest sense, would have required Ilse Koch to truly confront what she had done, to acknowledge it, to understand it, to feel its full weight. There is no evidence that she ever did this. She died, it appears, still wrapped in her narrative of victimhood and injustice, still refusing to see the prisoners she had tormented as the real victims in her story. The survivors who outlived Ilse Koch and who had to find ways to live in a world where she had been imprisoned, but never genuinely brought to account in the moral sense, represent the true measure of what her crimes cost. The men and women who had stood in the roll call square at Buchenwald while she looked down at them from a position of absolute power, who had been pointed at and selected for punishment, who had seen fellow prisoners beaten or worse at her direction, carried those experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Trauma of this kind does not end when the perpetrator is imprisoned or dies. It lives in the body, in the dreams, in the involuntary memories that can be triggered decades later by a sound, a smell, or a sudden flash of recalled terror. The lives of Buchenwald survivors were shaped by what happened to them there in ways that continued to unfold long after Ilse Koch was behind bars. The real accounting for her crimes is not found in the courtroom records, however important those records are, but in the lifetimes of interrupted possibility and persistent pain that her victims carried within them. The history of Ilse Koch is ultimately a history of what happens when a regime removes all the ordinary social and legal constraints on the exercise of cruelty and gives certain individuals license to harm others without consequence. The people who inhabited the concentration camp world, guards and administrators and commandants' wives, did not arrive there fully formed as sadists or murderers. Many of them were ordinary people whose capacity for cruelty was developed and enabled by the specific environment of the camp, by the daily reinforcement of the dehumanization of prisoners, by the social rewards of conformity to the camp's brutal norms, and by the absolute impunity that the SS system offered its members. Ilse Koch, as the evidence suggests, may have had more natural inclination toward cruelty than many of those around her. But the environment of Buchenwald did not create her capacity for harm out of nothing. It found it, and it nurtured it, and it gave it a scope for expression that it would never have achieved in ordinary civilian life. This is one of the most important lessons that careful historical study of cases like Ilse Koch's can offer. The question of how ordinary societies prevent the creation of environments in which cruelty is licensed and rewarded is one that remains urgently relevant. The Holocaust was not an event that happened in another moral universe, carried out by people who were essentially different from the rest of humanity. It was carried out by people who were, in most relevant respects, human beings much like any others, who found themselves in a system that rewarded certain behaviours and punished others, and who made choices about how to respond to those incentives. Some chose to resist, at great personal cost. Many more chose to conform. A smaller number chose to embrace and exceed what the system required of them. Ilse Koch was in this last category. Her case is a reminder that the conditions that produced her are not unique to mid-20th century Germany, that the potential for this kind of cruelty exists wherever power is exercised without accountability and wherever the humanity of victims is systematically denied. The Buchenwald Memorial today stands as a place of education and commemoration on the Ettersberg, on the very ground where the camp once stood. Visitors can walk through the remaining structures, see the reconstructed buildings, and engage with the extensive documentation of the camp's history that the memorial provides. The experience of visiting Buchenwald, of standing in the roll call square and looking out at the landscape that the prisoners saw, is one that many visitors describe as profoundly affecting. The memorial's educational programs reach tens of thousands of students each year, and its research programs produce historical scholarship on the camp and the broader history of National Socialism that continues to deepen understanding of what happened there. The name of Ilse Koch appears in the memorial's historical documentation as one of the camp's perpetrators, alongside Karl Koch, the SS doctors who conducted experiments, the commanders of the prisoner administration who maintained the daily regime of terror, and the many others who contributed to the deaths of more than 56,000 people. She is not the most important figure in that history, and she did not bear the greatest share of responsibility for the totality of what happened at Buchenwald. But her name is inseparable from the camp's history, and the crimes she committed there will be documented and remembered for as long as the memorial stands. The final chapter of Ilse Koch's story, her death in her cell at Aichach on September 1st, 1967, closed a legal and biographical narrative that had begun 30 years earlier when she and her husband arrived at Buchenwald to begin their tenure of terror. She had lived long enough to see the world transformed in ways that must have made her own life and crimes feel more distant, if not less real. The Federal Republic of Germany had become a prosperous democratic state and a founding member of the European communities that would eventually become the European Union. The concentration camp system that she had inhabited was the subject of historical scholarship, legal prosecution, and memorial commemoration. The survivors whose testimony had convicted her were, many of them, living in Israel, the United States, and across the world, having built new lives and raised new families. The world had moved on, though it had not forgotten. And on the morning of September 1st, 1967, in a women's prison in Bavaria, Ilse Koch, who had once been called the Witch of Buchenwald, and who had used that designation as though it were a title of honour, ended her own life. She was 60 years old. She had spent 18 years in prison. She had never expressed genuine remorse for what she had done. She left behind a son who had grown up without her, a historical record that documented her crimes in meticulous detail, and a name that would remain for as long as the history of the Holocaust is studied and taught, synonymous with a particular and terrible form of human evil. Well, that is it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and that it gave you a deeper understanding of one of the most notorious figures in the history of the Nazi concentration camp system. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about the horrifying crimes of Irma Grisi, as well as our video about what happened to the female SS guards after WW2. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more WW2 content. See you in the next one. The international dimension of the post-war hunt for Nazi war criminals provides important context for understanding how Ilse Koch's case unfolded within a broader landscape of accountability and impunity. While Koch was pursued through the American military tribunal system and subsequently through the West German judicial process, many other perpetrators successfully evaded justice by exploiting the chaos of the post-war period, the political pressures of the emerging Cold War, and the network of escape routes that came to be known as the rat lines. The rat lines were informal networks that helped Nazi war criminals flee Europe, typically through Italy and Spain, and then on to Latin America, particularly Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and Chile. These networks were facilitated in varying degrees by Catholic clergy, who provided false documentation and transit assistance, by fascist sympathizers in the destination countries, by former SS and intelligence networks, and in some cases by Cold War intelligence considerations that led Western intelligence agencies to protect certain perpetrators whose skills or connections were deemed useful in the anti-Soviet struggle. Among the most notorious beneficiaries of the rat lines was Adolf Eichmann, who escaped from American custody in 1946, while his identity was not yet known to his captors, and made his way to Argentina via Italy, where he lived under the name Ricardo Clement in Buenos Aires for more than a decade. Josef Mengele, the SS physician who had conducted horrific experiments at Auschwitz-Birkenau and who had performed the selections at the Birkenau ramp that sent hundreds of thousands of people to their deaths, also escaped to South America, living in Argentina, Paraguay, and eventually Brazil, where he died in 1979 after drowning in the ocean near São Paulo at the age of 67. He was never tried for his crimes. Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo chief of Lyon who had been responsible for the torture and deportation of countless Jews and French resistance members, including the Jewish children of Izieu, escaped to Bolivia with the assistance of American intelligence, which had employed him as an informant after the war. He was not extradited to France until 1983 and was not tried until 1987, when he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in prison in 1991. The contrast between these escapes and the fate of Ilse Koch is instructive. Koch was relatively easy to find because she had not fled and had not changed her identity substantially. She was arrested within weeks of the end of the war, and while the legal proceedings that followed were complex and controversial, she was ultimately imprisoned for the rest of her life. The perpetrators who escaped to South America, by contrast, lived for decades in relative freedom, some dying without ever facing trial. The success of these escapes was not simply a matter of individual cleverness, but reflected systemic failures of the post-war accountability process, failures rooted in political priorities that placed Cold War strategy above the demands of justice. The lesson drawn by historians and by those who advocate for accountability for mass atrocity is that the will to pursue justice must be sustained over time, must be institutionalized in permanent mechanisms rather than depending on individual initiatives, and must be protected from the political pressures that always threaten to divert it. The Wiesenthal Center and its work of hunting Nazi war criminals represents one of the most important sustained efforts to maintain that will. Simon Wiesenthal, himself a Holocaust survivor who had been imprisoned in several camps including Mauthausen, dedicated his post-war life to documenting crimes, locating perpetrators, and pressuring governments to pursue them. He was instrumental in the capture of Eichmann, in the identification of Hermine Braunstein Ryan living in New York, and in the pursuit of Mengele and many others. His documentation center in Vienna and later the Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles maintained records of thousands of perpetrators and worked tirelessly to see that accountability remained a live issue even as decades passed and political will waned. Wiesenthal's work was not without controversy. Some of his specific claims about certain cases were disputed, and his relationship with other organizations working in the same space was sometimes difficult. But the overall impact of his decades of dedication was enormous. He died in 2005 at the age of 96, having outlived most of the perpetrators he had hunted and having contributed more than perhaps any other individual to the sustained effort to ensure that the crimes of the Holocaust were documented and prosecuted. The broader question of what constitutes justice for crimes of the Holocaust scale remains philosophically unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. The legal proceedings that followed the war were genuinely important. They established facts, they created a historical record, they punished some perpetrators, and they developed legal principles that form the foundation of international criminal law. But they could not undo what had been done. They could not restore the lives of the 6 million Jews who were killed, or the millions of others who died in the camps and in the mass shootings and in the other mechanisms of Nazi killing. They could not compensate survivors for the years of suffering, the destroyed families, the stolen property, the psychological trauma that lasted 4 decades. They could not fully address the intergenerational trauma that passed from survivors to their children and grandchildren. Justice, in the sense of making things right, of restoring what was lost, was simply not available for crimes of this magnitude. What was available was a partial, imperfect but genuine reckoning, a process of establishing the truth, assigning responsibility, and imposing consequences. This is what the trials at their best achieved. The case of Ilse Koch and its aftermath also raises questions about the adequacy of life imprisonment as a response to crimes of this magnitude. This is not an argument for capital punishment, but rather a recognition that the standard tools of criminal justice, developed to address individual crimes within a functioning society, are in some ways inadequate to the scale and nature of crimes against humanity. The perpetrators of the Holocaust were not ordinary criminals who had committed terrible acts within a normal social framework. They were participants in a systematic project of mass murder that was carried out by a state and enabled by an entire social and political system. The legal framework developed at Nuremberg and refined in subsequent decades through the development of international criminal law attempted to address this inadequacy by establishing categories of crime, crimes against humanity, genocide, that went beyond ordinary criminal law. But the punishment of individuals, however appropriate in the specific cases, does not fully address the collective nature of the crimes. The concept of reparations and restitution has been another dimension of the post-war reckoning with Nazi crimes. The Federal Republic of Germany entered into agreements with the State of Israel and with Jewish organizations to provide financial compensation to survivors and to the families of victims. The Luxembourg Agreement of 1952, concluded between West Germany, Israel, and the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, provided for several billion German marks in reparations over a period of years. Individual survivors and their families could apply for compensation for property stolen or destroyed, for persecution suffered, and for other specific losses. The reparations program was imperfect, as all such programs are, and many survivors found the process of applying for compensation bureaucratically demanding and emotionally painful. But the program represented a recognition by the West German state of its responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi era, and was in its time an unprecedented acknowledgement of collective state responsibility for mass atrocity. German reparations to Holocaust survivors and their families have continued through the present day, administered through the Claims Conference, and have amounted to more than 80 billion euros in total. The ongoing relevance of the lessons of the Holocaust, and of cases like that of Ilse Koch, to contemporary concerns about human rights, genocide prevention, and international accountability is something that scholars and practitioners in the field of international law and human rights take very seriously. The development of the International Criminal Court, established by the Rome Statute in 1998 and beginning operations in 2002, represents the most significant institutional legacy of the Nuremberg precedent. The court has jurisdiction over the most serious crimes of concern to the international community, including genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Its creation was preceded by the establishment of ad hoc international tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda in the 1990s, which dealt with mass atrocities that had occurred in those conflicts. The Yugoslavia Tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, prosecuted individuals for crimes including the Srebrenica massacre of 1995, in which approximately 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were killed by Bosnian Serb forces in a crime that was adjudicated as genocide. The Rwanda Tribunal prosecuted individuals for their roles in the 1994 Rwandan genocide, in which between 500,000 and 800,000 Tutsi were killed in approximately 100 days. These contemporary examples illustrate both the continuing relevance of the principles established at Nuremberg and the continuing difficulty of implementing those principles in practice. The establishment of international tribunals and ultimately of the International Criminal Court represents genuine progress toward a world in which accountability for the worst crimes is not entirely dependent on the political will of individual states. But the limitations of these institutions are also real. The International Criminal Court has no police force of its own and is entirely dependent on states to arrest and surrender suspects. It has jurisdiction only when national courts are unwilling or unable to prosecute, and it has faced persistent challenges from states that resist its authority. The record of prosecutions for contemporary mass atrocities, while including some significant achievements, also includes many cases where powerful perpetrators have successfully avoided accountability. The memory of Ilse Koch and the crimes of Buchenwald thus remains not merely a matter of historical interest, but a living challenge. How does a society ensure that those who commit crimes against humanity face consequences? How does it maintain the institutional memory of past atrocities in a way that keeps their lessons active rather than allowing them to fade into abstraction? How does it educate new generations who did not live through the events and who are growing up in a world where other urgent concerns compete for their attention? These questions do not have easy answers, but the attempt to address them is itself a form of respect for the victims of Buchenwald and of the Holocaust more broadly. The survivors who gave testimony at the trials, who endured the painful process of bearing witness to what they had experienced, did so in the hope that their testimony would serve not only the immediate purpose of prosecuting specific perpetrators, but the broader purpose of ensuring that the world understood what had been done and was committed to preventing it from happening again. Whether that hope has been fulfilled is a question that each generation must answer for itself.